Thank you all for coming out to today's event. The Lecture Fund would also like to thank the Georgetown Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics for co-sponsoring with us for this occasion. Tonight we welcome Mr. Foster Winans, an ex-Wall Street Journal columnist who was convicted 30 years ago in a widely followed and highly debated insider trading case. From 1981 to 1983, he was a reporter and columnist for the Wall Street Journal before being charged with leaking the timing of his articles to a stockbroker. The Supreme Court case that ensued was the first attempt by federal courts to define insider trading. Mr. Winans served 9 months in federal prison in 1988, and since then he has pursued a career as a journalist, ghostwriter, and publisher of more than 70 topical nonfiction books. Mr. Winans is currently the principal at Winans Quensler Publishing and executive director of the Main Street Justice Project, a citizens' rights advocacy and education initiative. Professor Thomas Cook will serve as the moderator for tonight's presentation. Professor Cook has been a member of the McDonough School of Business faculty for what he refers to as a significant length of time, and has been the recipient of the McDonough Business School Distinguished Teacher of the Year Award. In his earlier life, Professor Cook served as a state prosecutor as well as a state public defender. During his tenure on the Hilltop, Professor Cook has incorporated the Foster Winans story into his undergraduate law classes as a vehicle for describing legal as well as ethical issues. The case study used by Professor Cook has been the famous case of Carpenter versus United States. Tonight is the first time that the two men are meeting to exchange ideas and viewpoints. Tonight's conversation will revolve around the current legal limbo over how to categorize, define, regulate, and possibly decriminalize an infraction which baffles most people, even many professionals. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming both Mr. Foster Winans and Professor Thomas Cook.
First, I want to thank Foster Winans for joining us tonight, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Just preliminarily, we spent a lot of time on the Hilltop, McDonough School, inviting distinguished speakers, many of whom have a long litany of accomplishments, good deeds, and tonight we invite somebody with bad deeds.
Dressed in black so you know who the bad guy was.
Somebody stopped me earlier and said, "Oh, he's here tonight because some judge ordered him to be good." I said, "No, he's not here as any, but he is here as part of what I'm calling the redemption tour." What do you think? Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Some of you may have little familiarity with what brought Mr. Winans into the news, so I'd like to just take a few minutes to share with you my understanding of how things developed, and you certainly will share with us any thing that I say that's incorrect. But Mr. Winans, according to the Wall Street Journal and the United States Supreme Court, had one of the most prestigious jobs you could possibly have on Wall Street. He was the two authors of the widely read column called Heard on the Street. This particular column was popular not only domestically but globally. I couldn't wait to read it every morning. And he would report on individual companies and sectors of the economy. Some days his news would be positive news, other days it would be negative news. But little did I know that there was a world of people out there that were making investment decisions based on what he was writing. And so I think it's fair to say, and the evidence would suggest, that if he wrote something good about a particular company today, all things being equal, there was a good chance that stock would bump up tomorrow or the next few days, and vice versa. If it was bad news, you'd also see a reversal. What we didn't know is that behind the scenes, Mr. Winans and some of his friends, and we'll talk about that tonight, and you'll see them depicted, were investing in those companies in advance of his columns coming out. And this is what the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York City had a problem with. Now, I think they struggled with it because it was not, and I never thought it was, classic insider trading. Please understand, this man was writing based on his own research, his own knowledge. And when this matter eventually went before the Supreme Court, they too struggled with an important aspect of the case. But as the story will go on, Mr. Winans was indicted by a federal grand jury, and he faced trial in New York City in front of a federal district court judge. He'll tell you tonight he elected to have a judge trial and not a jury trial. The judge found him guilty, and from that decision, Mr. Winans filed an appeal. His appeal was heard by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York State, and they affirmed his conviction. His attorneys then asked for something which is very rare and unusual, and that is a grant of certiorari for the Supreme Court to hear the case. And they do hear very, very few cases. But there had to be something about this case, the Wall Street Journal, just the fascination with this column that turned the justices on, and they agreed to hear the case. And unfortunately, I think, as a professor, that we were short a judge. There were only 8 justices on the Supreme Court. And that's a problem. When you only have 8, they still hear cases, but they potentially could tie. And that's what happened in this case. The justices split 4-4 on whether this was a violation of the federal securities laws. Unfortunately, they were unanimous 8-0 that this was a violation of the mail and wire fraud laws. And being found guilty of something that led very easily to them also finding the parties guilty of conspiracy. Mr. Winans will share with you tonight his experience not only in having a case in front of the Supreme Court, but actually being in the courtroom and watching a case get argued about him and his life. So that tells you something about the story. What impresses me about Mr. Winans today is that he's willing to share with you the bad experiences and what's turned out to be a good experience as a result of it. And hopefully we can, after tonight's presentation, we can walk away and say, here's a man that recognized some mistakes. I can see what he did. Never for the grace of God, it might have been one of us at some point in our lives. And rather than go in hiding and or continue to deny, he's been very open and candid about this. He's written a book. Because I think of his openness and honesty, he's become a very popular person on CNBC and other networks. He was a trying party when Martha Stewart was facing her indictment in her trial. The networks were calling on him for his expertise. And we were just talking today, you've got a big scandal now in Europe with somebody wheeling and dealing in trading, just getting let out on bond this afternoon with $7 million. America's looking to extradite this guy. The level of depth that goes into insider trading today is without any limits. I think very few people have a full grip on what it is about. This man was not an insider. He was not inside any of the companies in which he was reporting on. He was an employee for the Wall Street Journal. And because he was involved with the Wall Street Journal, this turned out to be a big national, global scandal, if you will, that took the headlines. It was headline news for a considerable period of time. So with that background in the case, I welcome you. Have I said anything about the background of the case that's not accurate?
Guilty as charged.
All right. Yeah. But I do want to start, if I can, just with a few little basic things which intrigued me. Number one, you elected to have a judge trial and not a jury trial.
Right.
The way I explain it to my students is you weren't contesting the facts. You were contesting the law.
Right.
It also should go, you actually went into the SEC and confessed.
Right.
Other players in this scheme, if you will, were not so generous. And let's understand who was involved. Mr. Winans, his roommate, and a handful of brokers at Kidder Peabody. Those were the so-called players. Please.
Right. Well, I was just going to do real quick. Is this on? You can hear me?
Did you show that? I'm here.
I think I did.
There we go.
No, it's not pointing outwards. Anyway, this is the who part.
So this is what I looked like when I had hair. I was working at the Wall Street Journal. That was my boyfriend, David Carpenter. He looks kind of evil. He was, unfortunately, an alcoholic, a psychopathic liar, and something else that I've forgotten. He's been dead for 25 years, so I get to say that. And we had a traditionally dysfunctional family. I made it, and he spent it. And that is Peter Brandt, who was a stockbroker at Kidder Peabody, who I met in the process of writing stories. And he's the guy who sort of suggested, hey, if you told me what was going to be in the paper tomorrow, we could make a lot of money. And he told it to me in a way that was kind of like a college prank. It sounded like, it had occurred to me that, if I wrote a positive article about Apple, it would go up, etc. And at the time, I was making the ransom of $500 a week. writing the best read stock market column in the world. I didn't really object to that. I was living on the Lower East Side when it was really scruffy, and I thought that was the coolest place in the world to be. But nevertheless, I didn't have any money. I was broke, and here shows up this guy who appears to be a millionaire, and the building below is the Racket and Tennis Club in New York. This is very exclusive. You will not see any Burrs or Steins on the name of the list of people who were members of that club. I'm half Jewish. I kind of notice these things. Maybe today it's a little different. They might even actually have women in there. I don't know. But that was 30 years ago, and I remember sitting there kind of not in awe. I've been a reporter for 47 years. Nothing awes me anymore. But just kind of like, I can't believe people actually live like this. You know, it was incredible. So, Norm Pearlstein, who is very famous because he was managing editor of the Wall Street Journal at the time. He is now, I think, the head of one of Time Inc.'s subdivisions. And that's Gary Pletka, who was my co-writer on the column. And that was Peter's house on Long Island. He had kind of a big house out on the North Shore of Long Island, which, and when I wrote the book, I had read The Great Gatsby. And Gatsby is about a guy whose name is Gatz, and he moves to the North Shore of Long Island, changes his name to Gatsby, and kind of reinvents himself. You know, he's like this young guy who sort of appears out of nowhere with all his money. Well, Peter Brandt, who was the guy that I was involved with when I did the research, after the case had broken open and I was writing the book, discovered his name wasn't Peter Brandt. His name was Peter Bornstein. He was born in Buffalo. And he hated having a Jewish last name because everybody told him you'd never get anywhere with a Jewish last name. And there was an entrepreneur, very wealthy guy in the paper business who lived in Connecticut, like Fairfield, Connecticut, you know, the wealthiest part of Connecticut. And his name was Peter N. Brandt. And he was a noted polo player as well. So he moved to Peter Brandt's hometown, changed his name to Peter N. Brandt, and bought himself a polo pony. But it was a real kind of like character because he couldn't afford like a good polo pony, so he got one that had one eye. And it kind of described everything he did. And he was sort of a frat boy, but he was like a frat boy that would have been really comfortable in about 1955. You know, whenever it was that he was in college, you know, he was wearing like smoking jackets, and you know, it's like he had kind of Frank Sinatra himself up, and his roommates were always making fun of him. And so let me go back here. So I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania on a dairy farm. You know, went to college when I was 19, hated it, quit. Everybody was quitting because of the war and everything else, and I came back to my small town in Pennsylvania, got work on the local newspaper, worked my way up through the business, was working in Trenton for a while, and then I got a job at Dow Jones on a wire service, and I got hired onto the Wall Street Journal, and it was the most bizarre thing in the world because here I am writing suddenly. I mean, I was at Dow Jones for 18 months when I got the column, so I had no degree in anything because I had flunked every class because I just didn't go to them. I spent like 2 years, a year and a half at McGill University, and I just, you know, it's not what I wanted to be. When I got to Dow Jones, I did not know the difference between a stock and a bond. I had to buy a book to read about it. And everything I learned on the job. So I had kind of a fraud mentality. I don't belong here. You know, it's like I'm going to be fired any day. And so Peter Brandt comes along, and he says in the tennis club over drinks, if you tell me what's going to be if you told me what was going to be in the paper tomorrow, we can make a lot of money. I laughed, kind of like the way, you know, they say dogs bark and humans laugh at the truth. I mean, I knew what he was saying was true. I'd always been curious, you know, because people were making money. I know when I would call somebody up and say, what do you think about Apple Computer? And I would hang up the phone, and like 3 seconds later, Apple Computer would start going up. They had figured out that I was writing about Apple, that it was probably positive because of the questions I asked. And so I figured everybody's doing it on Wall Street. That's usually how you kind of like rationalize unethical behavior. And also, a lot of people at the Wall Street constantly checking their stock. So the whole thing was kind of like, you know, what am I doing here, and what are the rules? I didn't really know. So I started calling. What happened was I needed some money. He gave me some money. I started. It's like something out of I don't know if Wall Street has payphones in it, the film Wall Street, but you know, I would go downstairs across the street to the AT&T building, go to a payphone, and I would call his office, and sometimes, and I had a code name. I wasn't supposed to use my real name because everybody knew about the column. They didn't want operators picking up that I was calling him. So we made up a fake name, and sometimes I couldn't remember the fake name, and the secretary would fill it in. I said, this is Mr. She said, Cohen. You know, it's like, the whole thing was kind of like it really felt like a college prank. You know, it felt like, you know, let's see if this works. And he ended up giving me $30,000, which was more than I made in an entire year. That was huge, of which I gave about half of it away. But I learned that later that he had made like $700,000. I thought he was what he appeared to be, which was a young, very successful retail stockbroker on Wall Street, catering to what they used to call the white shoe crowd. As it turns out, he had over-leveraged himself, he was in trouble, and he was looking for an easy way to make money to kind of get back on his feet. And when I showed up, it was like, you know, taking candy from a baby. I was at the Wall Street Journal. I loved the job. My boss was kind of bad cop, you know, bad cop, good cop. He was the bad cop. And every day I went to work, I figured this is the day I'm going to get fired because they're going to find out that I don't really know what I'm talking about. But as it turned out, I did a pretty good job in the column. After it was all over, that's what they said. Anyway, so one day I'm at work. Norm Pearlstein calls me up into his office, and this is like, you know, God called, and you have to go up to the 8th floor. And I'd never been on the 8th floor, and I'd only met God once. So I went up to the 8th floor, and he was there with the chief counsel for Dow Jones, and he said, the SEC is about to call in 5 minutes. They want to ask you some questions. And as soon as he said that, I knew exactly what it was. I knew what was going on, and I decided, like, in that instant, I said, uh-oh, I have to kill myself. And I decided that it's like, I can't live through this. I've been a reporter. I know what it's like. I see what people go through when they get in trouble. It doesn't matter whether you end up being innocent or guilty. It's just like, it's not a life that I want to live. I obviously got over it, but so the scandal breaks, and these were the illustrations that the Wall Street Journal used on the front page, and it's really I cringe when I look at these pictures. You know, it's like they sort of look like us. That's Peter Brandt on the right and me on the left, and the Wall Street Journal reported the whole thing. They reported that my boyfriend worked at the Wall Street Journal for a time. He was a clerk. We lived together on 14th Street, and we wore rings. And so they didn't say they're a gay couple. This is 30 years ago, by the way. This was like huge for a lot of gay people. It was huge. That somebody who was out. I didn't really care who thought I was gay or who knew I was gay when I worked at the Wall Street Journal. So it was not a big deal to me. But a lot of people criticized the Wall Street Journal for focusing on that part of it. And I figured if I was on their side, I would say, it's a gay ring. It's got to be a gay ring. You know, it's like they're probably all having sex with each other or something. So you know, it's like when you become the subject of a news story like this, it's just bizarre. And I was going through these things last night. I said I have to put together a few slides. So there's Peter Brandt. He's got the horns and the cigar, I think, and that's me, and that's the check, the money he gave me. The secret got out fast. What happened was, on the very first trade, it triggered an alarm at one of the exchanges saying, hey, there's some unusual trading here. The next morning, there's a column about that stock in the Wall Street Journal, and this happened like 24 times in a row. So somebody figured out that something was going on, and they found it actually on day one. It's just that we didn't find out about it until 3 or 4 months later. So I ended up writing a book about it. You know, the headline writers had a good time. Little Fish Takes the Fly. Nerd on the Street, you know, that was me. I was the nerd on the street. And this was in Esquire magazine, the crash of the Wall Street Four. It's just, you know, I made $30,000. I was not an insider. I was not like trading for a hedge fund or anything like that. But it was because of what I was doing for a living, where I was working, and you know, in the news media, if one outlet stumbles, everybody else is over, all over them. You know, it's like they just can't wait to make the other guy look bad. And this is my favorite, the Gay Yuppie Breakdown. That was in a gay magazine. This guy had done a couple of interviews with me. So the left hand is the hardcover cover that appeared here. This was the paperback, and that was the French version, French edition, which I show because the title is the same as the movie, and it came out about a year and a half before the movie, and we were trying to get somebody to make a movie out of it, and Oliver Stone made Wall Street. It was a sort of a similar story, a Svengali and a sycophant. Me the sycophant, Peter Brandt the Svengali. I think it's a great film. I think it's a better story, more interesting the way he told it. So, and then my case went to the Supreme Court, and it was there were only 4 Reagans at that time, and 4 non-Reagans, and then ultimately, Reagan appointed. I think it had 5 appointees to the Supreme Court or something like that. So we went to the trial itself. I should say was really harrowing because I really hated myself for what I had done, and not so much in a kind of a broad sense, but I worked with people who trusted me. They trusted that I wasn't doing something like this, and I had let them down, and I felt personally pretty bad about that. And in the trial, I had to see these people sit on the stand, talk about me. I had to take the stand. It was a very, very difficult experience. But I figured this is the American system. If it works, it works. At the time, a lot of my friends were dying of AIDS. I think I once counted over 100 people that I knew who died of AIDS, and I felt kind of lucky actually. I felt like, well, there are worse things that could happen to somebody. The judge found me guilty, and this is pretty cool. You can find an inmate. It's not a dating site. It's the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And so if someone has been in prison, you see like Rajaratnam, you can actually type his name in and find out where they sent him and what his release date is. The whole bit. That's pretty cool. Every once in a while, I look up people that I went to jail with. So when the Supreme Court denied my appeal, I was supposed to report to a jail in central Pennsylvania called Allenwood. No, it's the Lewisburg Penitentiary. It's a big sort of Depression-era building with a little camp next to it. The camp was where I was going to be. Minimum security, you can walk away anytime you want, but why would you walk away with a 1-year sentence and then get a 5-year sentence on top of it if you get caught? When I got there, my mother drove me to prison. When I got there, they said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, the judge told me this is where I'm supposed to do my time." And he said, "Well, you're not on my list." And I said, "Okay, well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, we're going to find out where you're supposed to be and put you on a bus." So he came back and said, "You're supposed to be in Danbury." There's a federal prison in Danbury. And I thought, "Oh, that's great. I'm going to take a break now to Port Authority. I'm going to grab myself a slice of pizza, and I'm going to go to jail." Well, that wasn't the bus he was talking about. He was talking about that bus. I ended up doing a tour of all the federal prisons in the Northeast on my way from Lewisburg to Danbury, and spent about 7 months there. And that was where I learned to be a ghostwriter and started writing letters for inmates who had petitions for their judges or they wanted to write to their mortgage company. But I ended up getting 4 people out of jail. It was an extraordinary experience for me to write a letter for somebody, making an appeal to a judge that actually resulted in a person getting their freedom. This launched me into my ghostwriting career. It's like, wow, something about the power of words, the power of language. And I learned a lot about what judges care about when it comes to sentencing. They don't give a crap that you're sorry. That's like, and I know federal judges and I know appeals court judges, and they all say the same thing. The word they hate the most at sentencing is the word sorry. What they want to know is, what did you learn? Why did you do it? What did you learn? And what are you going to do with this information going forward? So I did my time. I got out in 1988. When is this? This is 2003, I think. So all of a sudden the New York Times calls up and said, whatever happened to, and he wrote this very nice story. I had started a nonprofit writers organization in Bucks County where I lived, and this was kind of a big turning point in my life because instead of, a scumbag still alive, it says, from the ashes a ghostwriter rises, and I was enjoying being a ghostwriter, and so I figured, well, it wouldn't hurt for people to know that I am a ghostwriter. And then Fortune magazine, this is the picture I tell people that makes it look like I know, like you'll never find out where I hid the money kind of thing. The problem is that I didn't hide any money. But when my mother found out about what I had done, she said, are you telling me you don't have a Swiss bank account or something like that? I said, what a putz, $30,000, you threw away your career. And then when the Martha Stewart thing broke, all of a sudden, everybody wanted to talk to me, which I thought was really bizarre because what do I know about Martha Stewart? And I was the defendant. Like, I wasn't the lawyer. I didn't argue the case. I was just the guy who got swept up in the thing. But what they really wanted to know is what's going to be like in jail for Martha. Is she going to get beaten up? What's going to happen to her? And then I was writing op-eds about other people who were getting into trouble. And then the Times said, well, what do you think about insider trading? So I did some research, and I came up with this great quote by a libertarian named Harry Brown, since deceased, who said, insider trading is a sin, but it shouldn't be a crime. And he said, like any sin, people who can do it and people who can't complain about it. So the idea being that that insider trading, as it's more or less been defined, is information that really should be in the market. And I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a judge, but when I look at the insider trading laws, I say, well, the cases that they win are the ones where somebody actually stole some information, literally stole the information. They had signed a non-disclosure agreement, whatever it is. They weren't supposed to disclose this information. They had an obligation to a company, to somebody else. I didn't have that obligation, and I think that insider trading, there have been some ridiculous cases. Back in the day, there was a psychologist whose client was a woman his husband was involved in some big merger deal, and the psychologist went out and bought the stock, and they prosecuted him. There was a case more recently of a guy in New York whose girlfriend worked for Disney, or she might have worked for an investment bank, but he happened to look at her phone and see that there was a deal going down, so he bought stock and made like $200,000. They prosecuted him. Meanwhile, of course, the world is manipulating LIBOR and gold and everything else, and oil prices. So, I think that it's hard to. I think insider trading is that indefinable crime. So this is it. My ghostwriting career sort of took off in a way. Ghostwriters are invisible, so it's kind of hard to explain what that means, take off, but people started taking me seriously. And this was the Super Bowl of my career. I got to work with this guy on the left hand, on the right hand, in the book cover. His name was Ji Chaozhou, and he was Mao's English interpreter for 20 years. I got to spend a couple of months in China interviewing high-ranking Chinese officials, and had become sort of a minor expert on China and what China's ambitions are. So that's that. I think I'm going to skip the video. I had a video of some clips, and I think that's just kind of a waste of time.
Let's talk a little bit about process, if we can.
Sure.
Just for the audience, Peter Brandt, one of your co-conspirators, ratted you out. Turned government evidence.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I went to jail, I was seen as like the victim. And by the way, a lot of people thought I was the victim. One of the first TV appearances I did was Larry King, like when Larry King was, this was like 100 years ago, Larry King. And he was just starting out, he was in Washington, and it was a call-in show, and some people called in and said, aren't they making you a scapegoat? Doesn't everybody in Wall Street do this? The question was...
About Peter Brandt's role.
About Peter Brandt's role. So Peter Brandt was a wild man. He was Wolf of Wall Street. He was kind of a Wolf of Wall Street, that kind of, taking the clients out for fancy steaks, and making all kinds of sketchy investments and covering them up and that sort of thing. I didn't know all this at the time. So when I got the call from the SEC, I gave my partner David a note. And I said, I want you to take this note to Peter Brandt and explain to him that something's up. Because I didn't want to use the phone, you know. I thought maybe the phones might be tapped or something like that. And he did. So for that, he got obstruction of justice. And what Peter did was he created up phony invoices. David was sort of a decorator, so he made up some phony invoices about drapes or something like that to explain the money that Peter had paid me. You know, there's an expression that I heard in jail. There are no criminals in jail. They're just all screw-ups. The real criminals don't get caught. And it's kind of true. You know, it's like a lot of the people who are in jail, they don't like say, I'm going to commit a crime. I'm going to figure out what the sentence is and what the chances are of getting caught. It doesn't happen. It's all situational. It evolves over time. So at the end, it's in the book, there are these very emotional scenes in restaurants with people pushing each other around and, you know, no good cop, no bad cop, you know, we're all in this together, we're all gonna stick to the story. And in the end, he ended up going to the Caribbean and buying some stainless steel machine guns, and he was going to live on a yacht or something like that, you know, until everything blew over. I, on the other hand, had a really bad problem because I needed to protect the Wall Street Journal. This was what I had done was so egregious and such a violation of the implied trust between people who were reading the paper and the people who were writing the stories. Even though the stories were true, I didn't make anything up. Like, you know, I stand behind every story I wrote. I just told them what it was about and whether it was positive or negative. And so I went into the SEC. I took all my records, said, you know, I did it, but my lawyer informs me that he doesn't think it's a crime, at least not a securities crime. And Peter Brandt, meanwhile, was, you know, trying to figure out how to get away. Well, once they found out that I had more or less turned myself in, he cut a deal because he had other problems. He had been stealing from clients. So he became actually the witness against me, and I was the one pleading not guilty. And the reason we had a bench trial was because we figured a jury would probably look upon Wall Streeters as a bunch of, you know, greedy cheats, and they might not like the idea that, you know, it's a gay couple involved. So that's why we went with the bench trial. And we knew we were going to lose on the trial level anyway. It's just that kind of a case. And we knew we were going to lose in the appeals court, but we thought we might win in the Supreme Court. So,
and he did, by the way, get one hell of a deal.
Yeah,
because he wound up going to jail on weekends only.
Yeah, he got to do his time because he was married and he had a child. Maybe that wouldn't happen today. You know, he had married and had a child. The judge said you can serve it on weekends. What a scam that was. He got to go in on Friday afternoon and come out on Sunday afternoon and get credit for 3 days. I had to get credit for every single day I was in, but it was. And I tell people it was the best thing that ever happened to me, which sounds really bizarre, but obviously I was in an arrogant or some other state of mind that caused me to give myself permission to do something really stupid. It brought an end to a relationship that was not very that was not healthy. It sounds like this maybe isn't on anymore. And it also launched me into a book career. I always wanted to write books since I was 10 years old, and so now I have something to write about. So Peter Brandt was definitely in the universe of moral relativity. Peter Brandt was a bigger scumbag than I was.
All right, in terms of process, were you offered a deal?
Yes, I was. It was interesting. I was offered a deal. My attorney put it to the government and said, these two people are like spouses. They've been living together for 10 years. They share bank accounts. At the time, there was no protection. And the U.S. attorney came back and said, well, okay, we're going to charge Carpenter with obstruction of justice unless Winans agrees to plead guilty to, I think it was 2 charges. And that was considered, at the time, kind of a cheesy deal. that the prosecutor didn't want anybody to know about it, but happily it sort of came out of trial. But they did offer me the deal. And, you know, looking at it purely on paper, I'm sorry I didn't take the deal. Because in the end, I probably would have gotten less time. I would have been testifying against Brandt. But when I spoke to my attorney, I said, I'm inclined to plead guilty. I don't want to end up owing you, all the money that I ever make in the rest of the time I'm on this earth. And but he said, don't worry about it. We're going to the Supreme Court. And he knew this from like day one. He said, we're going to the Supreme Court. And my partner said, I don't want you to plead guilty for me. So, but that's why I decided to plead not guilty.
Tell us what it's like, please. Tell us what it's like being in federal court and listening to your life story.
Right. Well, aside from the trial, it's really bizarre to sit in the Supreme Court in the United States and listen to Sandra Day O'Connor and
Rehnquist?
Rehnquist and Mr. Conservative. I can't think of his name.
Would it be our fellow graduate, Justice Antonin Scalia?
Yeah, something like that. And just having this kind of like debate over what I had done, and I was sitting right behind the assistant U.S. attorney who had actually prosecuted the trial. So it was all very strange and very bizarre. And when we walked out, my attorney said, "Well, we got 4 votes, I'm sure of it. All we need is 1 more." And so the result was really disappointing, and I learned something. Every time I hear that there's a big case in the Supreme Court, and it sounds like the justices are going this way or that way, I realize that the justices love to play mind games. They love to argue the position against the position that they're going to take, and I think sometimes they do it on they do it just to kind of test that person's position. And it works, because you come out, you really don't know what the result's going to be.
How about the missing justice?
Lewis Powell had retired, before the case was accepted by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has to vote whether or not they want to accept the case, and they have to have at least 4 votes. So we knew we had 4 votes. Then Powell resigned. When Justice Kagan was being vetted by the Senate, they found in her files the vote to accept the case, and that was 5-4 with Powell on our side. Powell had voted to hear the case. He then resigned, and then the case was actually heard by only 8 justices. So, in theory, maybe I could have won the securities cases, but the rest was 8-0. It's like, so, that would have been a pure victory.
All right, let's open it up to some questions, please. And nothing is off limits.
Yeah. Who's going to Wall Street here? Who wants to go to Wall Street? I read somewhere that this is kind of like making a comeback. People who want to work in the investment business. I wonder if that's. I wonder why that is. And I would love to hear. I would love to hear what you have to say about what you think about Wall Street at this point. With all the insider trading cases and manipulation and stuff like that. Did you say you were going to Wall Street? You want to work on Wall Street?
I am, yeah.
Yeah. So what's your opinion about Wall Street at this point?
I mean, from my personal opinion, but it's definitely been villainized a lot in the media. But it's something that a lot of students do go into, particularly from Georgetown.
Is it just the money, or is there something else about it?
I think in terms of like gaining experience as a young graduate, it's kind of invaluable. Now it's in the sense that maybe it's not going to be like a career, but there's a sense that if you go to Wall Street for a couple of years, you gain some experience, then you can go and do something else that you might want to do more. So
right. I had someone, a young person, asked me, should I accept this entry-level position at Morgan Stanley? And I said, well, if you read the Wall Street Journal, at Morgan Stanley, they tell their representatives that you're an asset gatherer. You're not really managing people's money. You're not giving them financial advice. You're an asset gatherer, and that's what the big banks on Wall Street are all about. Is they gather assets, and the more assets they gather, the more money they have to play with, the more trading they can do with that money, the more money that they can make. I hope that in this generation of people who end up on Wall Street, that there'll be some people who will say there must be a better way. But I think Wall Street's kind of like a dying, sort of almost a dying institution in the sense that, like indie film and indie music and indie everything, finance has now sort of become democratized. You know, there's lots of places to go to find capital to start a company. So, ask me a question. Ask me something really embarrassing. Yeah.
Did no one else at the Wall Street Journal partake in insider trading?
No. Well, let's put it this way. Not to my knowledge. But I will say that one of the ways I gave myself permission to do this is, in those days, there wasn't a computer on every desk. There was one computer in this entire room full of reporters. And when we had to check the stock prices for the articles before we submitted them, we would go to this little tiny, green blinking screen and type in the symbol and get the stock price. I had to wait in line while all the editors were checking their portfolios. And I saw it. It's pretty obvious. It's like they're looking up their stocks. The stock market was going up and up at the time. And my perception is that there were probably a lot of people at the Wall Street Journal at that time who did not sleep the night they found out, what I had done, wondering if they were going to go after everybody, look at everybody's trading records. What about the ethics side of it? I mean, what's happened since then with insider trading is, when I got busted about two years before that, the SEC chairman said, "We're going to come down with hobnail boots on insider trading. We're going to get those bad guys on Wall Street." That was 30 years ago, and that really worked out, I guess. It's like, look what's happening. It's insider trading will always be an attraction on Wall Street, and I do think that Judge Rakoff, who was a friend of mine, and he was a lawyer who represented our side, who's now a federal judge in New York, and maybe you guys run across him in your studies, but look him up. He's been advocating changing the rules so that real insider trading that there's a corporate side to it, and there's a criminal side, or civil and criminal. But I think most insider trading should be legal. I think what should be illegal is a lawyer who signs a document saying, "I'm not going to disclose this information. I realize it belongs to my client," and instead goes out and uses it for his own benefit. That doesn't sound like insider trading to me. That's just stealing, and that's what the Supreme Court said. It ain't nothing. They said it's stealing. It must be stealing.
As you're going through the process, what was the attorney's feeling about the mail-in wire fraud? Slam dunk?
They never told me that. There was never any talk about the mail-in wire fraud statutes. It's interesting. It was always the securities. I found out recently from the lawyer who represented, who prosecuted, rather, the U.S. attorney who prosecuted Rajaratnam, that my case established, because the wire fraud was one of the charges, established the power of the SEC to get a wiretap authorization that had never been used before in insider trading cases.
Were wiretaps did it play a role in your case?
No.
Did not?
No. It was the Supreme Court decision, which this individual tells me opened the door for that.
Now, there comes a time when you have to appear back in front of your judge for sentencing.
Yes.
Did he hold it against you that you filed all the appeals? Did you pay a price for that?
The sentencing came before the appeals.
So nothing changed?
Yeah, right. Nothing changed there. Well, I'll tell you, one thing did change.
I told you I wrote letters for inmates who wanted to get their sentences reduced, and I got 4 people out of jail, and I was the 4th. So, I wrote a letter for myself, because when I saw what Brandt's sentence was, 8 months, weekends, which he probably complained bitterly about, because he was a complainer. I wrote to the judge, and the judge had said in sentencing, Brandt, he said, "You're at least as guilty as mine is, and probably more so." So I wrote to the judge, well, if A equals B and B equals C, it's like, maybe you could cut my sentence a little bit if he was at least as guilty as me, and possibly more so, and the judge did. Yes?
I was just going to ask how you distinguish between the insider trading that you think should be legal and the insider trading that you think should be illegal.
Right.
You kind of went into that with the lawyers, just more
Right.
on that.
Well, I think in the absurd level, I think that a psychologist who learns that a woman's husband is his business is going to be taken over, and he trades on that. That sounds like pretty innocuous to me. Who is he obligated to? The Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York recently overturned some insider trading convictions. Maybe you studied that. And one of the things they said was, in order to be guilty of insider trading, you have to actually get something of real value. It can't even be like friendship. It has to be something of real value. So I would say that that's a pretty good standard. In other words, if there's no actual bribe, like there was in my case, or some other effort to subvert somebody else's rights. In England, until 1980, insider trading was legal. And people who were on boards of directors and other people who worked at companies, executives, they could trade on stock anytime they want. The reason that it, by the way, there's some arguments to be made that the more information that's in the market, the more accurate the price is going to be. So when Martha Stewart got in trouble, the insider trading case against her was if the person who bought the stock that she sold and avoided a loss had known what Martha Stewart knew, they wouldn't have sold. And my argument is a little bit more objective, which is the person who bought the stock that Martha Stewart sold thought that was the right price on that day, regardless of what other information there was. And furthermore, it's not unusual that when somebody does insider trading that they lose money, but you don't never hear about that. It happens all the time. People bet on something that they think is a sure deal. They lose money. People don't get prosecuted for losing money on, trading on inside information. Yes?
Knowing what you know now, if you were to go back 30, 40 years ago, would there be a price much greater than $30,000, I assume, where you would have still told what you were writing about?
That I would still what?
So of his $900,000 that he took,
right?
How much of that would you have to receive in order to do the same thing? Or none of it? It wasn't about the money. I'll tell you what. I know that sounds kind of like dishonest, but it wasn't about the money. It was more about having, just not having zero in my bank account. Okay, so that's not, to me, that's not like making a lot of money. But it was the attention that he was paying to me. He was very flattering. He was so good, such a great Svengali, very seductive. Geez, you work so hard, and your columns are really great, and they only pay you $500 a week. That's outrageous. You should be making a lot more money than that. And I was feeling insecure, didn't trust my boss, and I think I just I wanted to be around him. He just was a very interesting guy. I wasn't interested in him in any other way, but he was just a very interesting guy. He was very funny, irreverent. He had a really cruel sense of humor that I loved, and I just wanted to be around him. Yes?
So given your experience in jail, what's your opinion on mandatory minimum sentencing?
Mandatory minimum, it's terrible. The whole sentencing system is horrible. I mean, I don't know how anybody could look at the sentencing system. I help a lot of young people who get involved in like minor scrapes, like pot, DUIs, that sort of thing. And I go sometimes to these at 9 o'clock. If you ever get a chance, go to a county courthouse. Go into the main courtroom at 9 o'clock in the morning. It's a slave auction, and everybody who's in there is a product. And the lawyers and the judges, they control the show, and you're just on a conveyor belt going through the system. And the system has these mandatory minimum sentences, which have nothing, are maybe completely divorced from the crime itself. That whatever it is you're being accused of, and there's so many other things you could do. Does it really help society to put somebody who like Bernard Madoff? Bernard Madoff. Okay, let's say Bernard Madoff his sentence is he has to do community service for the rest of his life. He has to go from jail
to the soup kitchen, or from jail to be an orderly in a children's AIDS ward or something like that. What is he doing in jail? You know, Justice, I think it was Justice Kennedy said once, we have to differentiate between the people that we're afraid of and the people that we're mad at. And the people we're mad at might not necessarily be supposed to be in jail. I mean, I actually am glad I went to jail, but I could have used a little less time. I got the joke. I got it so fast. And the 9 months that I was on the inside, you know, it just stretches out. You know, when you see the seasons turn, you know, and if you're in jail for more than a year, it's really hard because you have anniversaries, you have Christmases, you know, these things that come and go. Three years in jail, and you have no connections to the outside world. People don't come and visit you, and then they puke you back out onto the street, you know, with whatever $10 or $20 in your pocket and a bus ticket, and expect you to kind of just pick up where you left off, and it doesn't happen. How many people? Yes, go ahead.
What was jail for you like? Like, was it minimum security or?
It was minimum security. It was, you know, no bars, no razor wire. The guards didn't have guns. There were like 2 guards for 200 guys. The inmates ran the institution. And the reason is that everybody was there, had a short sentence, had ratted somebody else out. So they were kind of there as protection. Nobody wanted to do anything that would cause them to get another beef, another charge, and then have to do more time. I spent my time writing letters for people. I wrote about 500 pages of notes about things that were going on around me, and someday, hopefully, I'll do something with it. Yes?
How did your relationship with David Carpenter change after?
The short version is, you know, it just went downhill. I mean, we were tight through the trial, mainly because we were in the same lifeboat. You know, it's like, but once that was over, the things just kind of unraveled pretty quickly, and he moved off somewhere else, and then died a couple years later.
You made a very, I think, compelling argument to the Supreme Court that you hadn't taken anything.
Right.
And the court found something that you took called pre-publication confidentiality.
So what did I steal? I stole I stole the information that about what was going to be in the next day's paper. That's proprietary. It belongs to Dow Jones. The reason that it belongs to Dow Jones, they're holding it until the paper appears the next day, and that was the thing of value that I took from the Wall Street Journal. What was I going to say? There was one other thing I was going to say. That's correct, right? I have that right. You know, sometimes I have to ask the lawyers, and it's like, it's my case, and I kind of know what happened, but sometimes I'm not sure about it.
I mean, I thought that was a very creative argument. You obviously paid dearly to have somebody come up with it, but in the end, they said no go.
Right, exactly.
How about legal fees? You said you were cut a break. It must cost an enormous amount of money to have U.S. District Court trial, Federal Court of Appeals hearing, Supreme Court.
Right. The lawyers who represented us did because they knew what was going to the Supreme Court. It's kind of like taking on a celebrity client who maybe doesn't have any money. I didn't completely understand it at the time, but my lawyer, who was great, and I love him, said, you know, this is going to the Supreme Court, don't worry about it. You know, it's like, don't worry about the fees. And I had money anyway, so it was a question without an answer, but that's what happened with that. You know, one of the things that here's what I wanted to say. I taught once at a small college in Virginia where a student came up to me afterwards, and it was an accounting group. There were undergrad accounting students. And she said, our professor has advised us to save up 6 months worth of income in case we're asked to do something that we don't want to do. And that really resonated with me, because if I hadn't been broke, I wouldn't have been susceptible. I would probably have gone to my boss and said, you would not believe what this asshole asked me to do. Which would have been the right response. You know, so I would go to your boss and say, this guy tried to bribe me. It was an interesting thing, because we live in that age where
some supervisors, some administrators, some people who are going to be above you are going to ask you to do something that either in your gut or in your knowledge is, this isn't right. We're cheating somebody here. And this happens every day in business. And at some point, you may have to say, I have to keep this job because I can't pay my mortgage, I can't pay my rent. And you really don't want to be in that position. So ideally, if you can save up enough money to kind of be without work for about 6 months, you'll have a lot more choices than you would have had otherwise.
How about a couple more questions? Yes, ma'am, please.
How difficult was your transition from prison to the outside world?
It's an amazing thing about jail is you can spend. I talked to a guy who had 6 months to go when I met him, and he had been in for 6 years. And the Friday before the Monday that he was going to be released from that 6-year sentence, over that weekend I said, what does it feel like? It's like, you're about to go home. You've been in this system for six years. And he said, believe it or not, it feels like I got here on Friday and I'm leaving on Monday. And it was like a day. And it's like, all that time just kind of collapses. It's a very interesting experience once you get out of jail and you get back sort of into society. The time doesn't seem as long. It's just something psychologically, I guess it's a self-protection mechanism. So, yes?
Kind of going back to the ethics of insider trading, you were talking about how most of the cases would be innocuous, but wouldn't you be afraid? I've actually seen this already with proprietary information, that people with access to that information seek to entrench themselves. So what if once insider trading is more legal, people will try to come in and make certain pieces of public information proprietary, just so that they have that advantage. We saw with high-frequency trading, people will pay a premium just for 2 seconds faster access to that information.
Right. I'm not sure I can answer the question directly, but and we could spend a long time deciding what's inside information. I just think that no one seems to be able to. No one can tell me what insider trading is. If you talk to people that you know in your families, or some of you you encounter on the street, and you ask them what's insider trading, I guarantee you will get an answer that's either completely incorrect or just a look of puzzlement. People really don't know what inside information is. Yes?
Just sort of related to this question, are you aware of any cases since this that are similar cases? So it's, a paper like the Journal or whatever having information and a reporter. I've seen a lot of other types of insider trading contexts.
Right.
This is unique. So
There was a reporter at Business Week, or a columnist at Business Week, I think it was, who got in trouble about 2 years later. There was a printing, a person in the printing shop at another publication that got dinged. Those are the only ones that I know about.
Jim Cramer got slapped on the wrist for touting stocks on CNBC in the morning, and there was some investing going on. He was reprimanded and put off the air.
I ended up in all these famous quotation lists for saying that the only reason anybody would invest in the stock market is because they think they know something that others don't. And I think people presume that to mean that everybody who goes into the stock market has inside information. I don't mean that. What I mean is they think they know something that other people don't. They think they know that Apple's going to sell more iPhones next year. They think they know that these two companies are going to merge. It might be something that they've heard in an elevator. If, for example, the craziness about insider trading is what you hear in an elevator, you can trade on. 2 CEOs are talking about merging. You're the third person in the elevator. You run out and call your broker. That's not insider trading. You don't have an obligation to those people. But if you're a loading dock person, maybe, I don't know. In any event, I think it's very difficult to define. You raised your hand again?
I was just going to say, there's a difference between thinking you know something and being certain you know the price will move a certain way.
I don't think there is such a thing as knowing for certain. Because you can think that you have inside information. It's like knowing who's going to win the 6th race at Belmont tomorrow. But the next day, a plane might fly into the World Trade Center, and everything is going to collapse. You really don't know. It's a market. It's constantly shifting, and you can't know in advance. Sure, obviously, you know, if you're a lawyer and you're drafting documents, or you know that your firm is drafting documents having to do with a big deal, then, you know, you probably have a higher probability of succeeding. But I just think the whole thing is broken. I don't think that insider trading should be a criminal offense. I think it should be a civil offense to make them pay and pay and pay and pay and make them empty bed payments. You know, it's a wonderful thing to humble somebody who has done something wrong, as opposed to putting them in jail where they can hang around with a bunch of other convicts complaining about their cases and how somebody turned them in and how the prosecutor's an asshole and the judge didn't know what he was talking about. You know, it's like, you know, it's kind of college.
There were some reports that Chair Peabody had conducted an internal study, that they had looked at your column and they had looked at their brokers and their wheeling and dealing. I don't know if that was a true story or not.
Yeah. They knew what was going on. Yeah,
That's your question.
he was making a lot of money. He was bringing a lot of money into the office, and I don't know if you know it, but, you know, stockbrokers, you know, part of what they make in their commissions goes to the next guy up the ladder and the next guy up the ladder. It's kind of like the mafia, you know, it's like you pay it up. And so his bosses were making a lot of money on all this trading that was going on, and they had a pretty good idea what was going on, but they didn't want to know about it. By the way, neither did the Wall Street Journal, because when they asked me about it, they asked me questions that were I thought were designed to give me the opportunity to not answer. Is there any reason you think the SEC would be looking at you, you know, things like that, instead of, did you actually give this guy this information? They never even asked me that. And I think part of it is, I feel ashamed of because they trusted me, but also part of it was I think they really didn't want to know. They were terrified that maybe there was something really bad going on here. It's very, very easy to get sucked into situations like this. You know, opportunistic. You know, it's like, I have no money, guy comes along, you want to be a millionaire? Not really, but I'll take $30,000. You know, just kind of get out of this hole that I'm in. Anyway.
Other questions, please?
I'll be hungry.
Hearing none, I will ask everybody to please thank Mr. Winans for being here tonight.